going to make a funny. All right. Well, let's go ahead and just dig right in. You know, as we were looking at opposition from different LEOs and legislators last session, one of the big concerns was the impact that this program will have on law enforcement. And there were several different pieces that were brought up, but one of the ones that kept coming up and was brought up by multiple people is impaired driving. You know, what does impaired driving look like when someone is using medical cannabis, and what are ways that our law enforcement officers can identify, you know, that type of influence when someone's driving, and how can we really address that situation?
Yeah, well, first of all, I loved what you said at the very beginning. As someone who is in law enforcement and extremely pro law enforcement, to this day, even over on the Missouri side, I pride myself on ensuring that all of my clients have a strong relationship with their local law enforcement leaders, their police departments, and we share a lot of information back and forth. In fact, we have a very, my suggestion to my clients is that we have a very open and transparent organization, and we let law enforcement come in, we give tours, and we can even train law enforcement on medical cannabis and the growing process and all kinds of things. So what you said earlier about really embracing law enforcement is very true, and it's also true that law enforcement, we should listen to law enforcement's concerns, because when we listen to law enforcement's concerns, then we understand the how they're approaching things and what they're seeing in the field. We also have to understand that law enforcement is dealing 95% of the time, they're dealing with negative things. And so it's their job to remind us of the unintended consequences of anything that we may pass as a result of any kind of legislation. So I respect the fact that people have varied opinions on that. I think that's fine. And I also respect the fact that many states have passed this, and this is a wonderful opportunity for Kansas. As Thomas Jefferson once said, the states are incubators for great thought, and the ability for Kansas to be able to be one of those states that now can look at so many different states and understand what worked in some states, what didn't work in some states, and then begin to craft really positive legislation that ultimately is here to help patients in the state of Kansas that are suffering from illnesses. And I think I should mention that one of the reasons that I became attracted to this industry is, number one, there was a real need for my services, but the second was I have so many friends that are veterans in the military. I've seen first responders struggle. We have incredibly high suicide rates, and we now know through a lot of evidence and studies that medical cannabis can be a relief for those folks. And I'm seeing that with people that I've known a long time that have now have medical cards and are able to take care of themselves because they're suffering from some advanced pain from injuries or PTSD and some of those things. And so that's the reason it became kind of an important part in my life. But to get to your question specifically, and it's one probably that is at the forefront, because as we know, we're always going to be running in, or we think that we're going to be having people driving around intoxicated all the time. And again, it's one of those cognitive biases that we have in law enforcement, that we think everybody, because they're using medical cannabis, are just going to be all of a sudden use it and then get in their car and go drive, someplace, when in fact a lot of people that use medical cannabis are doing it at the end of the day. They're doing it when they're trying to relax and get a good night's sleep and some of those kinds of things. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but you talk to most people that are using medical cannabis, they're the first ones to say, I don't drive after I consume, medical cannabis. It's something that I want to try to stay at home, or I want to try to be in an environment that is going to help me with my illness and my recovery. But law enforcement, it's true that law enforcement would have a concern because we're so used to doing DUI arrests. Now, I was very blessed as a state trooper. I worked in the Kansas City Metro Division. I had over 350 DUI arrests in my 5-year career as a state trooper, which if you ask any law enforcement officer out there, that is a lot. That's probably more than anybody else is doing. But I happened to work the midnight shift for nearly 3 years in Kansas City. And it was not uncommon for me to arrest 125 to 150 drunk drivers a year, just myself. I'm extremely familiar with doing DUI stops and doing field sobriety tests. And ultimately, there isn't any difference. If someone's impaired, they're impaired, whether they're using alcohol or whether they're using some sort of drug, or in this aspect, cannabis. I think the important thing is we base our car stops on a very important constitutional privilege called probable cause, understanding that we have seen some sort of erratic driving take place that's going to give that officer, that state trooper, cause to say, I need to pull that individual over and find out why they're driving erratically, or why they're speeding, or whatever may be the issue. So the first thing is we're going to see erratic driving if we think that somebody's impaired, right? I mean, that's what you do on any type of car stop. The second thing is it's extremely important for law enforcement to understand that a lot of the psychomotor skills that occur with DUI stops when you're using alcohol are going to be exactly the same when it comes to medical cannabis. So there has been research has shown that, for instance, fine motor skills are difficult if you're under the influence of cannabis, that you're going to have the same gaze nystagmus results, which is the impact of the eye and whether the eye can track and dilate appropriately. In certain conditions, you're going to have that occur on field sobriety tests. The only thing that's going to be different is that you're not going to be able to do a blood alcohol test out in the field. And there are some companies that are working on that. I think at some point down the road, we will see a field test that will occur for some sort of medical cannabis, because it's just becoming so popular. But ultimately, it's different than alcohol, where you're not going to see a BAC performed. You would have to take some sort of urine or blood test in order to confirm that the person has THC in their system.
Yeah.
And so from a prosecutorial point of view, I'm not an attorney, but from a prosecutorial point of view, the burden in Kansas is, number one, were they doing something impaired? And did law enforcement have a probable cause to make that stop? The second thing is, did they fail a field sobriety test? And the field sobriety test is not going to change based on alcohol to marijuana. And as a matter of fact, right now, there are drug recognition experts that really know how to do this that are out in the field. One of my suggestions for solutions of this is that we need to have more officers trained as drug recognition experts, so they can understand and be able to do the right kind of field sobriety test and understand whether inebriation is really occurring. In fact, right now, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, in conjunction with the IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, does have an 8-hour drugs that impair driving course that can be taken free by law enforcement officers. And they also have a 16-hour course that is a follow-up to continue to have advanced training in that area. And so that's the interesting part, is if someone's impaired, they're going to be impaired, and law enforcement needs to use that probable cause and the fact that the person failed a field sobriety test, and you did do some sort of urinalysis or a blood test to confirm the presence of THC, and that would be what you would be able to have a prosecution for.
Okay. Yeah. So, one thing that we've talked about too before we had this webinar was, how long after the prohibition of alcohol ended did the first blood alcohol on-site test take to develop?
Oh my goodness.
I'm guessing a long time.
Yeah. So I'm going to date myself, because I was one of the You're a young person now. I remember there was a time when I was the youngest trooper sitting in the, in the dining hall with the other troopers. And now as I get older, but when I started in the Kansas Highway Patrol, we didn't have an immediate blood alcohol test that we could give. We had to base most of our arrests based on the field sobriety test. The blood alcohol test we found out later whether or not they had, those things in their system. So you can base a probable cause arrest based on someone being impaired, because if they're impaired, they shouldn't be driving. That's, you are making an educated decision to do that based on your training and your capabilities. That's the reason that law enforcement is, we live in a strange world right now where law enforcement is really being attacked at so many different levels. And I don't agree with it, but there's also opportunities for improvement that we can have in what was my profession. And one of those is we need to make sure that we are funding law enforcement well enough that they can have the kind of training necessary to be able to be the kind of servants, community servants in today's world.
Yeah.
And so we need additional training. There's so many police departments that are underfunded when it comes to, they just have enough maybe to staff their own departments and maybe have a little bit of money for operations. And they literally have a insignificant amount of money for training. And we have mental illness problems. We have crisis intervention that needs to be done. We have more weapons and training that we should, or training with weapons, self-defense. But training like this is so important, and we've got to be able to, number one, do the training, give the officers time to do the training, and make sure that they're funded well enough in order to keep us safe out on the street. And most importantly, that they're doing their job correctly and constitutionally.
Yeah.
And so those things I think are the most important. But it's really interesting that I found that studies have been, as a matter of fact, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration did a study in 2017 that showed the primary problems associated with people that were driving and under the influence of marijuana. It impacts psychosocial skills such as slow reaction time, road tracking, and lane position availability. So you see that in alcohol as well. You saw poor route planning, so somebody may not realize where they're at when they get pulled over. And then, but here's the interesting part: alcohol, you see increased speeds and more tailgating. With marijuana, what do you think they found in marijuana?
Totally the opposite.
Totally the opposite. You're actually driving slower and you're further away from the car in front of you. Now, when you think, I've never used marijuana, as a matter of fact, I'm dating myself again. When I became in law enforcement, you couldn't use any drugs or you wouldn't get hired back when I started. But when you think about, when you talk to people who use marijuana, people who usually use marijuana aren't aggressive. They're chill,
Yeah.
And so you're probably going to be doing the same thing in a vehicle. You're going to be a little chill and, so you're driving slower. So it may be that that officers and troopers that are out there may actually see people like on the interstate driving under the minimum speed limit, which is still, a probable cause for a traffic citation and a stop. But it's interesting to see the difference between alcohol and marijuana when it comes to some of those things.
So
and it's also interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting that THC levels really don't have any. It's not an indicator of intoxication of cannabis. So in fact, there was another study done by Druid that showed that drivers that are at least have a 0.12 BAC, they have a crash risk 20 to 20 times that of a sober driver. And drivers testing positive for THC only had a 1 to 3 time risk of accidents.
wow.
So it's much different. Alcohol's considerably worse when it comes to it. But if you're under the influence, you're under the influence, whether one's drugs, cannabis, or alcohol.
Yeah, I think you really nailed the nail on the head there, just about, providing that training and that support to law enforcement officers. Like I said, that was a big point that several representatives and law enforcement officers had brought up, is what, how to approach it. And I think if we can just provide this valuable information to them, like, hey, there's trainings, there's businesses out there that are, focused on providing those trainings
Yeah.
to officers as well. So there are definitely resources out there to provide that support that they were looking for.
And I also, you look at things I try to look at, I call them theme development, when people are bringing attention to the issues that they have. And in a lot of and I read a lot of the testimony that was provided by law enforcement, and there's always a reoccurring theme in some of those that it got back to, we need additional training, or there's not enough officers trained in this area. I kind of noticed that was a theme that occurred. And those are the kind of things we have to pay attention to. That if we do, anytime you bring in something new or a new legislation, we often have to think about the unintended consequences of that legislation, and make sure that we're planning in advance to take care of those things, so we mitigate unintended consequences. So law enforcement's there to remind us they have concerns in certain areas. We should embrace those concerns and make sure that we design, and especially for the elected officials, particularly, that they look at all of the information and say, okay, we recognize that they have some concerns in this area. This is what we're going to try to do legislatively to try to minimize that or counter that. But the elected officials, they're not just looking at safety, they're looking at the economic benefit of medical cannabis. They're looking at all kinds of things that are, it's not just necessarily related to criminality.
Yeah, so let's stay on that unintended consequences topic. Again, silver lining of being one of the last states to hopefully do this, gives us kind of a bird view of what worked in other states and what doesn't in relation to the effect it had on the Black market. So, we've seen that overly restrictive bills cause an increase in the Black market. It keeps that market thriving because it's cheaper, it's easier to get, whatever the case may be. So what are some ways that we can kind of mitigate that Black market factor? I mean, what have you seen as far as policy to shape good policy to keep the Black market from thriving?
I think that's also one of the big things that has to be discussed and be talked about in kind of plain sight, and have that kind of transparency associated with it. The Black market does not go away if we do things that doesn't help mitigate the Black market. So just because you pass and try to legalize something doesn't necessarily mean the Black market goes away. In fact, if it's done incorrectly, the Black market doesn't get impacted at all, or can grow. Depending on what you do. Let me give you an example. If you have cigarettes right now are taxed, right? If you want to buy cigarettes, you have to go in and you have to purchase them at someone who is a registered dealer of tobacco, and you have to purchase them, and there is a tax associated with that. And some states have taxed it so much that a Black market has spun out of control. Like New York City, for instance, they tax it so much that there is a significant Black market for tobacco and cigarettes. In fact, there was a person killed a couple of years ago by a New York police officer. It was the strangling incident when the person was selling street market cigarettes. So you can have a Black market, for anything. You can have a Black market for alcohol as well. So I think the first thing you have to look at is, how is the state going to what kind of caps are going to be put on taxes? Because the studies that I've seen related to taxing, that if the taxing authority goes high and looks at it as a cash cow, then people aren't going to purchase it, and it's going to go to the Black market, or they're not going to be interested in it to begin with. And so that's one of those things that can cause a Black market. Is there a cap on excise taxes? So is the state going to have a tax on it? And then is the city going to have a tax on it? And then is the county going to have a tax on it? So what kind of excise taxes and taxing authority is going to be done on it? Because we have to remember that as we drive pricing up, there could be a black market that comes in to fill that void, if you will.
Yeah.
The
I
other
mean,
thing I'm sorry.
we're seeing that in Missouri. I mean, I
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
from multiple people over there who
Right.
just say that it's fully thriving because of the caps imposed, you know, that just the access to the flower itself. I mean,
Mhm.
so being
And
able
then
to,
the other one is what you just said, there's supply and demand. So there's a basic economic principle associated with it that if the state regulates supply too low, for instance, they don't have enough cultivation facilities or manufacturing facilities, then all of a sudden demand can get where they look for the black market. And then conversely, if there's too many dispensaries and you know, or there's not enough dispensaries, then that could, you know, end up having an impact on the cost associated with it. So I think the biggest thing on black market is cost. Now, I think from the law enforcement point of view, there's certain things that we should look at that help mitigate the black market, and that is, do we have card holders? Are the card holders, do they have those things in person? Are we going to have databases that's going to show who a card holder is so law enforcement can look that up? I think we need to be careful with how much they see, because this is a medical cannabis thing, but I certainly understand law enforcement's point that they ought to be able to at least understand, you know, a name associated with an ID number, and to verify that a medical card is good, because there is such a thing as fraudulent medical cards. We see that in California. So I think the state ensuring that there is a database that law enforcement can check at a moment's notice to say, yes, that person has a legitimate medical card. And then the other one is, once, you know, if they have it on their person, what is it being contained in? How is it being contained? Because this, to me, this is not any different than Zoloft or any other kind of drug. You just can't have a couple of pills of Zoloft in a paper, you know, a plastic little baggie. It's technically, it's supposed to be associated with the prescription. It needs to be in the prescription container. So those are all the things that could be done by the legislature if they wanted to ensure that it's the right dosage, it's the right amount, and that it's in the right container. So that's one that they really should be looking at. And again, you know, making sure that the packaging and quantity is associated with what is legally being prescribed, you know, to the patient. I think the last thing is, or it's not the last thing, but I want law enforcement as a Kansan and as a taxpayer, and especially as a former cop, I want law enforcement to be still after black market. You know, I want them to go after people who are growing illegally. I want them to go after people that are not doing things according to the law. That's why the legislature is going to pass a law on it. So we're going to need their help to make sure that they are investigating the black market. There's an expectation that DEA is still going to be investigating the black market. Now, they've taken a hands-off approach in states that are doing medical cannabis, but if number one, if a medical cannabis provider is doing something illegal, then they should be taken down, and they should be investigated and charged criminally. But they're also there to go after black market and smuggling of marijuana and all those kinds of things, because you know, that can still occur. I think the other thing that they may want to, that could really have an impact on black market, is making sure that there's Missouri went through this. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Missouri originally had a stipulation in their regulation that said you could not possess a firearm and have a medical cannabis card. Well, that almost completely had a complete unintended consequence on soldiers and the military, because a lot of those folks had guns, wanted to be able to use them. And so again, we wouldn't do that if we prescribed a regular pharmaceutical drug to them. So rightly so, Missouri amended that. The governor, I think, signed it earlier this year, where now they are no longer, you know, have that restriction in it. So I think Kansas probably, it would behoove Kansas to consider not having that kind of same language because of what they saw Missouri go through. And it's really not fair to people who own guns who may have a medical condition in which they need to take medical cannabis.
So
Because you're not going to have people want to get the card.
right.
Yeah.
Well, again, one of those black market thrivers, is
Right.
the more, limitations and restrictions, the more it'll thrive. I mean, and that
Exactly.
makes sense. So on that, I don't believe that the bill that we worked on last session and have continued to work on says anything about that. So that's a really great point to bring up. Unintended consequences are definitely, what we want to stay away from, and having the insight to do so is definitely important. But I think that on that note as well, one of the points that was brought up was the impact of legalization on crime rates. There were a couple of statistics thrown out that places like Colorado, crime has increased significantly, not only crime, but suicide rates among teens and teen usage. So what have you learned about that? And does that still ring true? And is it a concern for Kansas?
Well, once again, I think anytime law enforcement brings up something, we should look into it and understand it. And so we can either address it or understand where the data is coming from. I think it's very important for the legislature, when they receive information, is to make sure that that some information is not conflated. So I think as a professor and a researcher myself, I've written many papers and done quite a bit of academic work, and of course, being in higher learning as well. It's easy to conflate things, but if crime occurred in Colorado, you can't automatically assume that that's associated with medical cannabis. Crime occurs for a myriad of reasons. It can occur just because you have population density increases. So in many ways, crime can be arithmetic in nature. So, I mean, if you have 100,000 population increase, then you're going to have an increase in crime because it's an arithmetic number that would naturally increase. And so you have to really be careful making certain leaps sometimes to say just because someone had a higher murder rate or a higher crime rate, that you automatically go back and link it to a individual thing within the wider criminogenic system. So I think that's one thing that we need to have cause for concern. The other one is we want to bring medical marijuana into Kansas. We're not talking about legalization of marijuana in Kansas. We're not talking about recreational marijuana in Kansas. We're talking specifically about medical cannabis being legalized in Kansas, which is far different than the standards that would be set or the consequences that occur as a result of any other kind of legalization that's out there. So the most recent study that I've seen that has been done literally by the National Institute of Justice, which is a division of the Department of Justice. This was a June 2020 study that was done on the effects of marijuana legalization on law enforcement and crime. And basically this was done in the state of Washington, and it was extremely interesting. The study found that marijuana legalization had not had overall consistently positive or negative effects on law enforcement and crime. And now we're talking about medical marijuana. And so the qualitative data suggested a couple things. One, that it did cause and when I say quantitative is a number, and qualitative is kind of the color behind the numbers. It's more feeling-based data. And so the qualitative data actually showed that marijuana legalization has increased concern about traffic safety issues, which we see that because law enforcement's concerned about that.
Right.
A greater youth access to marijuana, we hear that. That's another That's another cognitive that people automatically are tracked to. And then the personal of sales of marijuana that are coming from out of state, or people coming into the state to purchase marijuana, or going across the state. Kansas has seen this with Colorado being legalized in Missouri. What happens if you have a legal medical cannabis user in Missouri that goes to Colorado to visit somebody, and they get caught on a car stop, and they have their medical cannabis on them, as an example. So but the real net positive impacts that were in this study is legalization had apparently coincided with an increase in crime clearance rates. So not an increase in crime, but there was an increase in crime clearance rates in several areas, suggesting that legalization may result in a net positive, especially in the redistribution of police resources. And so, and again, you have fewer people that are actually being brought into the criminal justice for minor possession of marijuana. And so that's not a Currie Myers study. That's an actual National Institute of Justice, Department of Justice study that was recently done. So there's also even a one that was done this year by the Journal of Criminology and Criminal Justice, 2021. One studies found that the legalization of marijuana rates had no effect on crime rates, or in some areas reduced crime rates.
Wow.
There was a panel study on the entire US. Everybody that had some sort of legal marijuana found no evidence that medical marijuana laws, not just any marijuana laws, but medical marijuana laws increase rates of homicide, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, and auto theft. These are the ones classified as most serious crimes. And there was no evidence that medical marijuana caused any increases in those areas in the states that were studied. And again, it was with respect to medical marijuana. So, you know, the data to me seems to support that we're not seeing that net positive increase in crime that is because it's related to medical marijuana laws that have been passed. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't increases in crime, but we have to understand there's other reasons why crime occurs. It's not just because someone has a medical marijuana card and it's using it.
Right. Right. Well, and when you are eliminating pieces of the black market as well, you would anticipate to see crime associated with that also go down.
Yeah.
That is wonderful information. I think that will be very helpful to some of the pause that.
Yeah. And I have no, I'm a big believer in the use of sources and citations. So for the listeners out there, I have no problem supplying my notes, Heather, back to you guys, that these things can be studied further. But all I ask is that anytime you see any data, including the data that the sources that I use, make sure you see whether or not there's a true cause and effect to the individual issue that we're talking about, as opposed to just saying, well, they have marijuana legalization in a state, so therefore the higher crime indicates that it's truly indicative because of marijuana.
Right. That saying about correlation and causation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's it's kind of a link that you don't necessarily can prove. It sounds good, but there are other causations for crime that cause increases that are much more significant.
Yeah.
And again, I can't help but stress, just an increase in population, you are going to have an increase in crime.
Right.
Because it's an arithmetically simple thing.
Yeah. I am going to bring up one last talking point, and then I see we've got a couple hands raised. But just to kind of wrap it all up and get into the Q&A, what can we do? So, we've discussed this, but as the chamber, our goal is to provide support for this industry as best that we can. We want to provide support to our legislators who are creating this policy. We want to provide support to law enforcement so that they are comfortable. I am of the mindset that, all ships rise with the tide, right? So we want to be supportive and be there for everyone. So what are some ways specifically to law enforcement that we can be supportive outside of the training? What are ways that as a chamber, as an industry, as business owners, how can we best support law enforcement to help them feel more comfortable through this transition process?
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because that's, to me, that's near and dear to my heart. And that's what I'm trying to do in Missouri, is that we make law enforcement a partner within the community, that it's not an us versus them agenda. As a matter of fact, if a client doesn't want me to reach out to law enforcement, they are not a client of mine. And so that's how if I'm hired, I indicate at the head of being hired by somebody, is that we are and will be a pro law enforcement organization, and we're going to invite them into our facility. They're going to tour our facilities. They're going to understand just how professional it is, just how scientific it is, and they can also come. As a matter of fact, I had one of my licensed facilities. We actually helped solve a auto theft that occurred at a neighbor across the street at a car rental place. And so we provided that video footage to the law enforcement in the St. Louis area, and they were able to solve that crime. I have one community that we because it's in a high crime area, we have literally shared our exterior cameras with law enforcement, that they can get on anytime and look at the exterior cameras. And it was a request made by the chief, and I was happy to do it. So I'm not saying that that's going to occur at every situation, but if you have that kind of partnership, you're more inclined to say, yeah, I'm willing to help you out. So I think the first thing you have to do is have empathy for law enforcement, and the fact that when they are looking at something, they're looking at something from a negative bias, because that's who we are. We're around that all the time, and we have to understand that they are seeing things, and we want to make sure that we understand what they're seeing and try to help them and promote the fact that we want to help them when it comes time to any kind of crime fighting that's occurring. I think some of the other solutions is that we definitely need more DRE training. And I love the fact that there might be our industry itself might be able to help out, and maybe there could be a funding mechanism to make sure law enforcement gets the kind of training that they need. I think cannabis operators in Kansas are going to have to be accountable and transparent in the thing that they do, in the work that they do. And I think the other thing is we need to have strong the ability really to go in and have auditing and inspections done at our facility. And that's exactly what I do. So it's one of those things that we have to have a system in place, that we should have a good seed to sale tracking system that can follow the product from point A until it's sold. I think we need to create and issue standards on secure transportation of marijuana and infused products. I think we need to make sure that we're including standards on licenses, that we actually delineate what kind of security requirements are that need to be in those facilities, so law enforcement can feel assured that those things are being done. I think there should be common sense compliance that is done at the facilities to ensure that they have good quality control, and that what's being put into the product is professional and is done according to the best practices. So the rules specifying, qualifying conditions is set forth by the physician. At the card state, being able to identify people who have medical marijuana cards. So these are all things that I think are next steps that actually ensures law enforcement that they can be prepared for, anything that can occur out in the field. And there's a lot of different things that can occur. I think the interesting part for me is wherever I've gone, I've established a relationship with law enforcement. And I think if you would talk to those law enforcement officials, they not only welcome us and part of the community, but they actually feel like we're part of the crime solving problem, because we've opened our doors and we've shared that that kind of respect for each other, to include, you know, hey, we're having a law enforcement night, come and have some pizza with us and things like that. So there's just so many things that can be done to bridge that gap between law enforcement and this industry. And I think Kansas, the way Kansans are to begin with, that's who we are. We're that kind of people anyway. And so we have high respect for our law enforcement officers, and this is certainly a win-win situation for, you know, for both of those different sides.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I look forward to any opportunity that, as the president of this organization, can provide to law enforcement or legislators in any capacity of support, just to make sure that everything runs smoothly and that we have a thriving program here.
Well, I appreciate the chance to speak, and I do. Any legislator that wants to reach out to me personally, I'll make sure and put my contact information. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll do what I can to research it. But I'm happy to provide any information that I can, and or give you information on my experiences that I'm seeing personally in Missouri.
Awesome. Thank you, Currie. We do appreciate it. I am going to open it up the last 10 minutes for a few questions, if that's all right. Let's start with Chuck Schmidt. He has his hand raised. Hi, Chuck.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting discussion. I just want to thank you for the emphasis on scientific research, professional scientific research. There's not a lot of respect for quality research these days, and I think we need to make sure that's the case. The other thing that you mentioned about cause and effect, and Heather mentioned about apparently crime rates rose in Colorado, and that may or may not be affected by their legalizing marijuana. But the other point is they have recreational marijuana. We're talking about medical marijuana, and we need to point that out to people, because the general public gets very confused on this. And I've had this happen numerous times, where as soon as you start talking about medical marijuana, they get very defensive and think you're just opening up your recreational marijuana. So we have to continue to emphasize that.
You know, Chuck, you're 100% right. Heather, I hope you don't mind me responding.
Go right ahead.
Chuck, you're 100% right. There is a difference. And there's also a difference between how you roll out recreational marijuana. So at some point, Missouri's probably I think they're going to be rolling out recreational marijuana in a couple of years, probably. But Missouri's going to take the approach that they're really not going to change their standards just because they're going to have recreational. And so once again, this is where states can have a great impact on how they're going to control. If a state does do recreational, there's still huge standards that you can put into place and compliance that you can put into place that minimizes crime. If you just have open-ended then, you know, recreational marijuana, then you probably are going to have higher crime rates associated with it. So it just depends on how it's governed. But you're absolutely right. We're talking about medical marijuana in the state of Kansas, and that's far different than legalization of marijuana or recreational marijuana. But even if you do ever decide to go to recreational marijuana, there are still many standards that can be put into place that control you know, the use and the application of those laws that helps minimize further unintended consequences. I hate to use that term, but it happens so much in life that we have to pay attention to you know, if you roll out laws, be careful sometimes what you do if you haven't planned for it correctly.
I honestly believe that gives us an advantage to be able to look at all the unintended consequences from various other programs.
Exactly.
And I think that legislators definitely need to consider that when we go back in session and talk about this bill is, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel. We just need to get it moving for Kansas and use what we have out there to make it the best.
Yeah, there's so many different states that have already done the legwork. Let's pick out the best of them march on.
Exactly, exactly.
Yep.
Okay, next we have a question from Michelle Manning. Dr. Currie, what do you suggest is needed in Kansas to convince the legislators to seriously consider approving a medical bill?
Well, I think we're close. I mean, I've talked to a few legislators, and the theory of it, they weren't against. I mean, there are some, but Kansas, I can't remember. I think it was 68 or so % of the public is supportive of medical cannabis. That, it may be more or less, I don't know, but that's some data that I saw. And then if you talk to most legislators, they aren't against it. They just want to make sure there's control mechanisms put in place, which I agree with.
Yeah.
And it's what control measures you're going to put into place. And again, if you make it too hard, you got to be careful about the unintended consequences of black market. If you make it too restrictive, you have to, there's all those kinds of things. So I think most legislators are open to the idea. There's some that are going to be against, but I think the vast majority are open to it. I think the bigger question is, how do they get there? Ultimately, how do you get there and have the kind of law that everybody can approve at the end?
Yeah, and Representative Susan Ruiz actually just made a comment on that as well, that the House did pass a medical bill. It was come out of committee in the House, passed the House, and then went to the Senate, where it's still sitting. So it hasn't been shot down yet. And that's really, what we're going to continue working on as a chamber, as part of our sister organization with the Kansas Cannabis Coalition, to see that this is the year that this happens. And it feels good. And I think that we're in a really good position to push over that finish line finally here in Kansas.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to Chuck Smith's earlier comments, is we really have to explain to people what medical cannabis is. That there is a difference. This is talking about helping people who are suffering from pain and other medical issues, and that has to be probably a greater narrative.
Yes, and Kansas Normal, definitely a big pusher for that fight too. Thank you, Michelle. Next up, we're going to go to Nick. He asked a question, but he has his hand up, so I'll let you ask your question in person.
Thank you for being here. I remember in 2015, I think it was, we had House Bill 2282, which was Otis's bill. And, I think they had some movement on the House floor. One of my concerns with a medical cannabis program is if we get a bill passed even next year, I'm worried that there's going to be a stalling effect to actually implementing it that could even last, for 2 years. There's the issue of home grow, and when we talk about, there's no such, we can apparently grow tobacco and make berries and make our own wine, and those don't require medical cards. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm in the wrong Zoom meeting, but it just seems to me that descheduling cannabis off the State Controlled Substances Act would help alleviate a lot of these issues, regardless of the federal government's prohibition, which kind of helps to make the black market. And so we have all these smoke shops and CBD stores now that are doing the Delta 8. So you can go buy cannabis light in all these places. And so I just don't understand the big deal with all this, especially when law enforcement are taking officers off of sex crimes and other crimes so they can perform drug stings. I don't know if there's some questions in there, but as far as home grow and using the verbiage marijuana versus cannabis, hemp, and all that stuff, just some thoughts. I'm really interested in this chamber. I'm really interested. I was a police officer for 1.5 years here in my town. So I have a little bit, tiny bit of experience in that area, but I want to be involved and I want to help promote these things. But I also want to give my opinion on them as well. So I thank you for your time, and I'll let the commentary stop.
That's I appreciate you taking the time to tell us your opinions on this. I think having open discussions is the key to moving forward. So I do appreciate that. As far
Yeah.
as different aspects of the bill, specifically home grow, that one has been a hot button topic for a lot of people in this space. And it really kind of comes down to, you know, especially in Kansas, you really do have to walk before you run. And I think that there is just some concern around some of that. And I mean, I totally get what you're saying. But I think that step one is making sure that we get the bill passed and get the industry in place. And then there's always room for improvement. There's room to expand on it once we see what's working, what's not working. You know, if there's issues with patients, especially in rural counties who are having trouble getting access to their medicine, you know, home grow has shown to be a solution to that problem. So I think that there is definitely room for improvement. I know right now it's step one before we can run.
I do have a specific question. Could he Mr. Myers, Dr. Myers, could you recommend a status of cannabis for the State Controlled Substances Act if it were just to be medical, as far as recommendations versus prescriptions? Because you can't actually prescribe cannabis due to federal regulations and whatnot. But as far as the State Controlled Substances Act, where do you think cannabis should be moving forward?
Well, I mean, it's even when I was a DEA agent, I was as a KBI agent, I was farmed out 5 years to the DEA. I never really understood why cannabis was a Schedule I drug, even when I was investigating those things. So that's kind of the first thing. So I think I think this is truly a decision between a physician and the patient to understand what volume of cannabis has to be taken. And you know, Missouri's taken the approach that it's between the patient. There are limitations on how much a doctor can prescribe X to so many grams at a time, and it just depends on what the patient's issues are, what their problems are, and we're seeing variations. So we're seeing you know, different types of cannabis. There's combinations of different types of cannabis that are being used in different strains because you want to have different effects from the different strains of cannabis in order to be tailored towards whatever your medical ailment is. So a particular strain of cannabis can help in one area, but you may have to have a different type of strain that may help in like pain management, for instance. But if you're suffering from PTSD, there may be another strain that is more effective for you. So it's really one of those things that, you know, there's also cannabis nurses out there that understand these things very well. That can also be someone that you should be talking to. You know, once you have the doctor's prescription, I think the next step, in my opinion, would be that you know, seek out a good cannabis nurse to understand how different strains and types of marijuana can satisfy some particular ailments you may have.
Yeah, there's so much potential for this, for patients and for this industry here in Kansas. So making sure that the policy that's written to support both the industry and the patients is definitely important and at the forefront of what we're fighting for here at the Chamber. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. Chuck, did you have another question?
Well, just wanted to make a point. Before I was in the legislature, I was an officer in the Silver-Haired Legislature, which is people 60 and older. That is an ally for you. They overwhelmingly voted to approve medical cannabis. And that's a group you wouldn't think would do that. Of course, we all grew up in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, but anyway, I would say let's get that group involved in this because legislators listen to them because they vote.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you said that. My husband and I, we own a CBD company and we were one of the first here in our area in Overland Park. And we were shocked that the majority of the people coming into our store were 60 plus. And it was like, oh, okay, cool. Allies. I don't know what we were really expecting or thought, but it was awesome. There was just a really There was a breadth of understanding there that we just weren't prepared for, but that's wonderful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
They're the ones that need it probably more than anyone.
Absolutely. Okay. Did you have another question, Nick? I don't know how to hand, I don't know how to put the hands down. They just stay up, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I could go all night. As far as the DUI, can you explain maybe a little bit if somebody has prescription medications, you can still get a DUI on that, or opioids or benzodiazepines or antipsychotics, but and I might be a little confused. Maybe you can clarify the difference between per se versus impairment. So, I mean, I know they want a tool or a breathalyzer or something like that, but it's not like there's not any option. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, they already have steps in place to arrest somebody for if you're impaired with medical marijuana. It already exists. The only thing they can't prove is they don't have a BAC capability to prove how much toxicities in the person's blood. So it's they can't get that immediate readout. In the evidence or the research that I've seen, there is no amount of THC. It's not like blood alcohol that it increases means you're more drunk. If you have increased in THC, does not necessarily mean you're more inebriated. So it's kind of interesting to see the difference there. But the main reason why you stop somebody is you have probable cause, unless it's a DUI lane. You have probable cause, and the second is you still go through a field sobriety test, and there are going to be, if someone's truly impaired, they're going to fail that test. And then you would, if you could give them a BAC, if it doesn't read out anything, then you could make sure that they do a urine or a blood test. But an officer could still arrest somebody for driving impaired, and it would be pending that, the results, whether or not something came back positive with respect to what kind of drug was in their system. If it does, and they were impaired, and you have it body camera and you have cameras that show it, then juries are going to say, yeah, that person's impaired. I can see the person struggling and not being able to stand at attention. They're not being able to count. They failed the gaze nystagmus test. All those things that are done by law enforcement now are still applicable with respect to if someone was just using drugs, any kind of drug, not just cannabis.
And I want to say, I apologize if I sound a little impatient or borderline hostile. After I quit, or while I was a police officer, I realized that I did not want to be a police officer or law enforcement officer as long as cannabis was a prohibited substance. And so the last 8.5, 9 years, I have been going up to Topeka, testifying in committee multiple times per year, trying to get cannabis descheduled from the State Controlled Substances Act. But I want to thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you to this chamber, and thank you most importantly for allowing me to speak. So I'm done. I'll stop.
Thank you, Nick. Please feel free to reach out to us at the chamber or me personally. I mean, we'd love to, continue this conversation. This is a very, very important conversation to have, and we are definitely grateful that you've given us your time, Currie, to talk about this. I think the lack of progress on this topic in this state is attributed a lot to an education piece. How can we best educate and provide substance to the powers that be to bring this issue forward? And I think this webinar is one of those steps. It's one of those educational pieces, and your background has obviously afforded you expertise and experience in it. So thank you. We do have one last question. And I thought this question might come up because I sent you the article yesterday and was like, well, this is interesting. From Sharon Gordon, we have, what do you think of their recent confiscation of money from a Missouri cannabis firm that was transporting their proceeds to Colorado while passing through Kansas? Before you answer, I'm going to say, I think this is exactly the reason why we need to have reform here, but I'll let you tackle this.
Yeah, so it's one of those questions that, so let me start out, again, I'm showing my age, but I was around when asset forfeiture came into being, came to be by the federal government, and states started to adopt it. I believe in asset forfeiture. I believe in asset forfeiture when it's linked to criminality. I don't believe in asset forfeiture if law enforcement hasn't proved that there's a link to criminality. So that's where we've taken it a bridge too far. So when you have agencies that just seize money and don't go the process of proving criminality, I'm not familiar. I haven't done I don't want to speak specifically about this case because I don't know enough about it. And there's two sides to every story. But in general, asset forfeiture, and I've written about this in op-eds and I've done papers on it. We also need to look at fines and fees and the supplantation of police budgets through fines and fees. Law enforcement should be budgeted on standalone general funds. And that kind of goes back to why law enforcement doesn't have enough training budgets, is that they're, even for operations, sometimes they have to do fines and fees in order to supplant their own police budgets. And so that's not a good way to operate. But when you talk about asset forfeiture needs to be, I'm a huge believer in the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution. As a sheriff, I took that, all law enforcement takes that vow and oath, but I felt it particularly as a sheriff to protect the constitutional rights of my constituents. But it's so important that if you are going to seize property in the United States of America, it should be based on some criminal intent that you have been able to prove that those funds came from some sort of illegal activity, and you're able to prove it in court. What we're seeing nowadays in civil asset forfeiture, I think, has become a bridge too far.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people that would agree with you on that as well.
Yep.
Well, that is the end of the questions, and we're only 10 minutes past what time we said it would end. So that's pretty solid for us on a webinar. I want to thank you guys all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Currie. I also want to remind everyone that this is part of our Cannabis in Kansas series. There is another webinar we are hosting next Wednesday night to discuss the economic impact of a medical program in Kansas. That'll be with Kelly Ripple, and that is also another very big discussion point for this policy and moving forward. So we'd love to have you join next week as well. If you guys have any questions after this, please feel free to shoot me a message, send me an email. I will collect the data that you had talked about, Currie, just the different points, and send a follow-up email for anybody who may be interested. And those will also be going out to legislators to provide them with some content to be able to move into the session to discuss this topic further. Thank you, everyone, again. I have put the PayPal link if you are interested in donating to help us get this past the finish line. Please hop on over to our PayPal. Everything is appreciated. Currie, thank you so much. All the wonderful questions. And I look forward to seeing you all right back here next Wednesday evening. Have
Nice job, Heather.
a fantastic evening. Thank you, Currie. I appreciate it. Good night, guys.
Bye.